February 1943. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, the man who commanded every single bomber in the Royal Air Force, sat across from a middle-aged engineer and delivered his verdict. The idea before him, Harris declared, was nothing but tripe of the wildest description. Complete nonsense, not the slightest chance of success. The engineer could leave now. 3 months later, that same Arthur Harris stood in front of newsreel cameras and said something nobody expected. "Now, you could sell me a pink elephant," he admitted. The man who had dismissed the proposal as lunacy was suddenly a believer. What changed his mind? A weapon that defied every rule of conventional warfare. A bomb that bounced across water like a skipping stone, leapt over protective nets, clung to concrete walls, and detonated 30 feet underwater. A single raid that unleashed 330 million tons of water, crippled the industrial heart of Nazi Germany, and forced Hitler to pull 20,000 workers off the Atlantic Wall just to repair the damage. But before any of that happened, the engineer had to survive the system that wanted him gone. This is the story of Barnes Wallis, the bouncing bomb, and the Night 19 Lancaster bombers changed the course of the war. The target was the Ruhr Valley, the industrial heart of Nazi Germany. This single region produced 60% of the Reich's steel, 70% of its coal, and housed over 1,500 factories dedicated to the war effort. 3 massive dams controlled the water supply for the entire operation: the Möhne, the Eder, and the Sorpe. Together they held 410 million tons of water behind walls of reinforced concrete and masonry. That water powered the steel mills at Essen, the armament plants at Dortmund, the coal processing facilities across the valley. Without water, there was no steel. Without steel, there were no panzer tanks, no artillery shells, no U-boats. The British War Cabinet had known this since 1937. Intelligence reports marked the dams as strategic targets of the highest priority. Ministry of Economic Warfare analysts calculated that destroying even one of these structures would cripple production for months. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, would later confirm their fears. The loss of these dams, he admitted, would be catastrophic. But knowing where to strike and actually striking were two very different problems. The Möhne Dam stood as the primary fortress. Completed in 1913, it stretched nearly 2,200 feet across the valley, rising 130 feet above the reservoir. The base measured 112 feet thick, solid masonry designed to hold back 140 million tons of water. The Eder, 30 miles south, was even larger. At 640 feet wide at the base, it was the biggest dam in Europe. The Sorpe, built with an earthen core, presented a different challenge entirely. Every defensive measure imaginable protected these structures. The Germans installed anti-aircraft batteries on the surrounding hills, 8 guns at Möhne alone. Barrage balloons floated above the reservoirs on steel cables, ready to shred any aircraft flying too low. Searchlights swept the water at night. And then there were the torpedo nets, heavy steel mesh suspended from floats across the entire width of the reservoir, hanging 90 feet deep. Anything approaching underwater would tangle and detonate harmlessly. The Royal Air Force had already learned this lesson the hard way. High-altitude bombing runs achieved nothing. Dropping a standard bomb from 20,000 feet and expecting it to hit a wall 100 feet wide was pure fantasy. The best bombardiers in Bomber Command couldn't guarantee that kind of precision. Low-level torpedo runs? The nets made those suicide missions with zero chance of success. Conventional military thinking offered no answer. The dams stood untouched, mocking every strategic plan, protected by physics and German engineering, until one man decided that impossible was just another problem waiting for the right equation. That man was Barnes Wallis, and at 54 years old, he was about as far from a typical military hero as anyone could imagine. No uniform, no medals, no combat experience, just an engineer with a slide rule, a notebook, and a track record of solving problems everyone else had declared impossible. Wallis started at the very bottom. At 17, he walked into the shipyards at Cowes on the Isle of Wight as an apprentice, learning to rivet steel plates and read blueprints. No university, no family connections, no shortcuts. He worked the docks by day and studied mathematics by night, teaching himself structural engineering through correspondence courses. When he finally earned his degree at 35, it came through the University of London's external program. Everything he knew, he had built himself. His first major project was the R-100 airship, designed and constructed between 1926 and 1930. At 709 feet long, it was the largest aircraft Britain had ever attempted. Wallis engineered the internal structure using a revolutionary geodetic framework, a lattice of lightweight metal struts that distributed stress across the entire hull. The R-100 flew to Canada and back in 1930, crossing the Atlantic in 78 hours. It worked perfectly. Then, the government-built R-48 crashed, and the entire airship program was scrapped. Wallis watched his masterpiece get dismantled for scrap metal. He moved on to Vickers and applied the same geodetic principle to bombers. The Wellington, which entered RAF service in 1938, used his basket weave framework instead of traditional ribs and spars. Pilots and engineers thought it looked fragile, almost flimsy. They changed their minds the first time a Wellington returned from a mission with a hole in the fuselage large enough to crawl through. The geodetic structure redistributed the load, kept the aircraft flying, brought crews home alive. By 1943, over 11,000 Wellingtons had been built, more than any other British bomber of the war. But Wallis was not interested in incremental improvements. He wanted the big problems, the ones with no obvious answers. While most aeronautical engineers focused on making planes faster or stronger, Wallis spent his evenings calculating the physics of dam destruction. He filled notebooks with equations about hydrostatic pressure, shockwave propagation, and the energy required to fracture reinforced concrete. His colleagues at Vickers thought he was wasting time. The Air Ministry thought he was delusional. Arthur Harris thought he was an outright nuisance. None of that stopped him. He had an idea, and ideas, Wallis believed, only failed when people gave up on them too soon. This one he intended to prove with mathematics, physics, and a bucket of water in his back garden. The experiments started small. Wallis set up a makeshift catapult in his garden at Effingham, a simple wooden frame with rubber tubing stretched across it. He filled a large metal wash tub with water and positioned a wooden board at one end to simulate a dam wall. Then he borrowed his daughter's marbles. The concept was straightforward. If a sphere struck the water at the correct angle and velocity, it would not sink immediately. Instead, it would skip across the surface, exactly like a flat stone thrown across a pond. The first attempts confirmed the basic principle. A marble launched at a shallow angle bounced once, twice, sometimes 3 times before losing momentum and dropping into the tub. Wallis recorded the angles, the velocities, the distances, but something else caught his attention. When the marble finally reached the board at the far end, it simply bounced off and rolled away. No contact with the vertical surface, no chance of detonation against the target. The physics worked, but the application remained incomplete. Then he added backspin. Using a modified catapult that could impart rotation to the marble as it launched, Wallis sent another sphere skipping across the water. This time the result was completely different. The marble bounced multiple times, just as before, but when it reached the wooden board, it did not bounce away. Instead, it rolled down the vertical surface, maintaining contact with the wall as it sank. The backspin created grip, adhesion, a behavior that defied intuition. This was the Magnus effect in action, the same principle that makes a spinning tennis ball curve through the air or a golf ball slice sideways. The rotation generated lift perpendicular to the direction of travel, and underwater, that lift pressed the bomb against the dam wall. Wallis moved the experiments to a larger tank at the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington. He built scale models of the Möhne Dam, complete with miniature torpedo nets. Spherical projectiles gave way to cylindrical shapes, closer to what an actual bomb would look like. High-speed cameras captured each test, frame by frame. The cylinders skipped cleanly over the nets, struck the model dam, and rolled downward exactly as predicted. The data was irrefutable. Wallis scaled up the calculations. A cylindrical bomb weighing 9,000 pounds, spinning backwards at 500 revolutions per minute, released from an aircraft flying at exactly 232 miles per hour at precisely 60 feet above the water. The bomb would skip across the surface, clear the torpedo nets entirely, strike the dam face, and roll downward while still spinning. 30 feet below the surface, a hydrostatic pressure fuse would trigger detonation. At that depth, the explosion would occur in direct contact with the dam structure, with the full force of the blast focused against the concrete, rather than dissipating into open air or shallow water. The pressure wave, compressed between the dam face and the water mass above it, would create a hammer blow capable of shattering reinforced masonry. The mathematics supported it. The physics supported it. Small-scale testing supported it. But convincing the Air Ministry to build a 5-ton spinning bomb and hand over a squadron of Lancaster bombers for an untested theory? That required a very different kind of battle, one Wallis was about to fight against his own side. The Air Ministry responded first. In April 1942, Wallis submitted a detailed paper titled "A Note on a Method of Attacking the Axis Powers." 47 pages of calculations, diagrams, and projected outcomes. The response came back in a single paragraph. The ministry did not consider dams to be targets of sufficient interest. Bomber Command had other priorities. Resources were stretched thin across North Africa, the Atlantic, and the bombing campaign over Germany itself. The proposal was declined. Wallis went higher. He contacted the Ministry of Aircraft Production, then the Admiralty, then anyone with enough authority to authorize a full-scale test. Every door closed. The official position remained unchanged. Unconventional weapons were a distraction from proven methods. The RAF needed more bombers dropping more conventional explosives on German cities, not experimental devices that required specialized training and carried no guarantee of success. Defense committees reviewed his proposal 3 separate times, 3 separate rejections. His own employer turned against him next. Rex Pearson, chief designer at Vickers, called Wallis into his office and told him to stop wasting company time on silly nonsense. The Wellington production line needed attention. The Windsor bomber project needed oversight. Bouncing bombs did not appear on any contract, did not generate revenue, and did not justify the hours Wallis was spending on private experiments. If he wanted to keep his position, he needed to focus on work that actually mattered to the company. Wallis refused. Pearson suggested, not particularly gently, that perhaps Wallis might be happier working elsewhere. Then came Arthur Harris. By early 1943, Wallis had secured enough support from mid-level staff officers to get a meeting with the head of Bomber Command himself. Harris sat through a 10-minute presentation, listened to the theory, examined the photographs from Teddington, and delivered his assessment without hesitation. The entire concept was tripe of the wildest description. Bouncing bombs, spinning cylinders, precision attacks at 60 feet over water in the middle of the night? Not the slightest chance of working. Harris had lost enough crews to practical operations without throwing them away on fantasy engineering. The meeting ended. Wallis was shown the door. But Harris made one critical mistake. He underestimated how stubborn a working-class engineer with a slide rule could be. Wallis did not accept rejection as final. He continued testing at Silvermere Lake in Surrey, refining the bomb's shape, adjusting the spin rates, perfecting the calculations. He documented everything with photographs and mathematical proofs. Then he went around the system entirely. He contacted an old acquaintance, Frederick Winterbotham, a senior intelligence officer with direct access to the Chief of the Air Staff. Winterbotham understood strategic value better than Harris did. He took Wallis's test footage from Chesil Beach, full-scale trials showing a prototype bomb skipping across Weymouth Bay, and delivered it straight to Air Chief Marshal Charles Portal. Portal watched the film. A rotating cylinder, released from a modified Wellington, bounced more than 20 times across open water, covering 1,300 yards before sinking. The camera angles were clear, the results undeniable. On February 26, 1943, Portal overruled Harris. He authorized the construction of the bombs, allocated 30 Lancaster bombers for modification, and set a deadline. The operation would launch in May. Each Lancaster would need its bomb bay doors removed and hydraulic motors installed to spin the weapon before release. Vickers received orders to manufacture enough bombs for the entire squadron. That gave Wallis exactly 8 weeks to turn a garden experiment into a weapon of war. 8 weeks meant no time for second attempts. Vickers engineers worked around the clock at their facility in Burr Hill, producing bombs under conditions of absolute secrecy. Each weapon measured 60 inches long, 50 inches in diameter, and weighed exactly 9,250 pounds when loaded with 6,600 pounds of Torpex explosive. The outer casing was machined steel, 3/4 of an inch thick, designed to withstand the impact of hitting water at 230 miles per hour. 3 circular belt rings wrapped around the midsection, attachment points for the hydraulic motors that would spin the bomb before release. The operation received its code name, Upkeep. The bombs themselves became known simply as the Mine in all official documentation. Security protocols locked down every aspect of production. Workers at Vickers assembled components without knowing the final purpose. RAF ground crews at Scampton prepared aircraft modifications without understanding why bomb bay doors were being removed. Even the pilots selected for the mission would not learn their target until days before takeoff. The Lancaster modifications presented their own challenges. Avro engineers at Scampton Airfield removed the bomb bay doors entirely from 30 aircraft. Without doors, the bomb would hang partially exposed beneath the fuselage during flight, creating significant drag. That meant reduced range, higher fuel consumption, and increased vulnerability to enemy fighters. But there was no alternative. The bomb needed to drop cleanly and begin spinning immediately upon release. Standard bomb bay mechanisms could not accommodate that requirement. Installing the spin motors required precision engineering under extreme time pressure. 2 hydraulic arms mounted inside the bomb bay, positioned to press against the belt rings on either side of the weapon. A chain drive connected the motors to the aircraft's main hydraulic system. Before release, the bomb would spin backwards at 500 revolutions per minute, building up rotational energy. The entire mechanism had to function perfectly at 60 feet above water, at night, under enemy fire. No margin for error existed. Testing moved to Reculver bombing range on the Kent coast. Full-scale prototypes, identical to operational weapons, were loaded onto modified Lancasters and dropped over the Reculver towers, medieval ruins standing in shallow water. High-speed cameras tracked each drop. The first test on April 13th produced mixed results. The bomb skipped correctly, but disintegrated on the 4th bounce. The casing was too thin. Engineers increased the steel thickness and added reinforcing struts. The second test on April 29th worked perfectly. 7 bounces, contact with the target structure, clean sink rate. Further trials revealed additional problems. At speeds above 240 miles per hour, the bomb began to tumble rather than skip. Below 220, it sank on first impact. The acceptable window was 12 miles per hour, requiring pilots to hold precise airspeed while flying lower than most church steeples. Wallis calculated that wind conditions, aircraft weight, and even minor variations in engine performance could push the bomber outside that narrow margin. Training would have to be extraordinary. But one critical problem remained unsolved. How could a pilot flying at 300 feet per second in complete darkness over water maintain an altitude of exactly 60 feet? Too high, and the bomb would shatter on impact. Too low, and the aircraft would strike the surface. Visual estimation was impossible. Altimeters were useless at that range. Wallis had designed a weapon that required inhuman precision from the crew delivering it. The solution came from an unexpected source. A young bomber command officer named Benjamin Lockspicer suggested using spotlights. 2 Aldi's lamps mounted on the Lancaster, one in the nose, one in the rear ventral position, angled downward so their beams converged at exactly 60 feet below the aircraft. When the 2 circles of light merged into a single figure-8 pattern on the water, the pilot knew he was at the correct altitude. Simple, mechanical, foolproof. Workshops installed the lights on all 30 Lancasters within a week. By early May, everything was in place. 56 operational bombs sat in storage at Scampton. 30 modified Lancasters stood ready on the tarmac. Navigation routes had been plotted. Intelligence photographs showed the reservoir levels at maximum capacity, the dams holding more water than at any point in the previous 12 months. The window of opportunity was closing. The raid had to launch before the end of May, or the water levels would drop and the entire operation would lose its strategic impact. All that remained was assembling a crew capable of flying the mission. That task fell to a 24-year-old wing commander who had already survived more combat sorties than most pilots would fly in a lifetime. Wing Commander Guy Gibson had earned his rank the hard way. At 24 years old, he had flown more than 170 combat missions, first in fighter command during the Battle of Britain, then switching to bombers in 1941. He had survived raids over Berlin, Hamburg, and the Ruhr Valley itself. Most pilots did not last 30 missions. Gibson had completed 5 full tours of duty. When Harris needed someone to lead an operation that required absolute precision under impossible conditions, Gibson was the only logical choice. The squadron formed officially on March 21, 1943, at RAF Scampton in Lincolnshire. It carried no name, just a number, 617. Within the base, crews referred to it as Squadron X. The Air Ministry pulled pilots and navigators from existing units across Bomber Command, selecting men based on experience and performance records. No one volunteered because no one knew what they were volunteering for. Orders simply arrived, transferring crews to Scampton with immediate effect. The final roster numbered 133 men, 21 crews, 7 men per Lancaster. They came from across the Commonwealth: Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Flight Lieutenant John Hopgood, a 21-year-old from Surrey, had completed 2 tours. Flight Lieutenant David Maltby, 23, had survived a crash landing in a burning Wellington. Pilot Officer Les Knight from Australia was 22 and already had 50 missions logged. The average age across the squadron was 22. These were not seasoned veterans with decades of military service. They were young men who had simply managed to stay alive longer than most. Gibson gathered them in a briefing room at Scampton on March 24th and told them precisely nothing. They would be training for a special operation. The target was classified. The tactics were classified. The weapons were classified. What they needed to know immediately was this: they would be flying at extremely low altitude, at night, over water, and they would need to maintain exact speed and height throughout the entire approach. Questions were not invited. Training began the next day. Gibson led the first sortie himself, taking his Lancaster down to 60 feet over Derwent Water in the Lake District. The reservoir, surrounded by hills, provided conditions similar to what they would face over Germany. Flying that low required constant concentration. A single error, a moment of distraction, and the aircraft would strike the surface at 200 miles per hour. There would be no recovery, no second chance. The training was brutal and unforgiving. On April 16th, crew member Pilot Officer Warner Otley pushed his approach too low during a practice run over the wash. His Lancaster clipped the water and cartwheeled into the sea. All 7 crew members perished. The accident report was filed quietly. Training continued without pause. Every pilot understood the risk, and every pilot kept flying. The crews practiced the approach profile relentlessly. 60 feet altitude, exactly 232 miles per hour airspeed, straight and level flight for the final 425 yards to target. Bomb aimers used wooden triangular sights, measuring the angle between 2 towers on the dam. When the towers lined up precisely with the sight's arms, the bomb would drop. The margin for error was less than 50 yards. Released too early, and the bomb skipped over the dam. Released too late, and it struck the wall at the wrong angle, detonating uselessly. The spotlight system proved its value immediately. Pilots could judge altitude with absolute accuracy by watching the convergence of the 2 beams on the water below. Ground crews installed the Aldi's lamps without explanation, adding to the growing list of modifications that made no sense to the air crews. Missing bomb bay doors, hydraulic motors mounted inside the fuselage, strange belt mechanisms hanging beneath the aircraft. Every Lancaster in the squadron looked like it had been assembled by someone who did not understand how bombers were supposed to work. By mid-April, crews were completing practice runs with consistent precision, but they still had no idea what they were training to hit. Gibson knew. Harris knew. Wallis knew. The rest of the squadron would find out 48 hours before takeoff. Until then, they flew their routes, practiced their bombing runs, and waited for orders that would send them into Germany on the most dangerous low-level raid ever attempted. The final briefing took place on May 15th. Gibson revealed the target: the dams of the Ruhr Valley. the Möhne, the Eder, the Sorpe. Photographs covered the walls showing the structures, defenses, and approach routes. Intelligence marked 8 anti-aircraft guns at Möhne, 3 at Eder. The round trip from Scampton measured 1,200 miles, flown entirely at low altitude to avoid German radar. At 21:28 on May 16th, Gibson's Lancaster lifted off. The formation followed at intervals, dropping to tree level over the North Sea. The first loss came before reaching Germany. Flight Lieutenant Monroe struck power lines over the Wadensee, damaging his tail section. He turned back. Minutes later, Flight Lieutenant Rice hit water over the Isselmeer hard enough to rip off his bomb. Another abort. Gibson crossed into German airspace at 2300 hours, following the Ruhr Valley at 60 feet. Anti-aircraft fire erupted sporadically, but the Lancasters moved too fast for accurate targeting. At 00:15, he reached the Möhne Reservoir. The dam stood clearly visible under moonlight. At 00:28, Gibson began his attack run. Spotlights converged at 60 feet. The bomb dropped, bounced across the water, cleared the nets, struck the dam, and detonated. A massive column of water erupted. The dam held. Flight Lieutenant Hopgood went next. German gunners found their range. Anti-aircraft fire struck his Lancaster mid-approach. The aircraft exploded and crashed beyond the dam. Only 2 crew members survived. Gibson flew alongside the next bomber, drawing fire. Flight Lieutenant Martin's bomb hit. Another explosion, still intact. Flight Lieutenant Maltby followed. His weapon detonated against the same section. The structure held. Then, Flight Lieutenant Shannon. The accumulated damage was building. At 00:56, the 5th bomb fell. Pilot Officer Knight's weapon struck the weakened section dead center. The dam wall cracked and collapsed. 330 million tons of water began moving down the valley. Gibson transmitted the success signal. Nigger. Möhne breached. He turned toward the Eder Dam, 30 miles southeast. The Eder had no guns, but steep hills surrounded the reservoir. Pilots had to dive into the valley, level out, release, then climb steeply to avoid crashing into the opposite shore. At 01:52, Flight Lieutenant Shannon's bomb breached the Eder. A second dam destroyed. 202 million tons of water released. Gibson ordered the remaining aircraft home. 8 Lancasters did not return. The wall at Möhne failed completely at 00:57. 330 million tons of water, held back for 30 years, began moving. The initial surge formed a wave 33 feet high, traveling at 15 miles per hour down the Möhne Valley. Everything in its path disappeared. Villages, farms, bridges, railway lines, roads. The wave reached the town of Neheim within 20 minutes. By 0200 hours, floodwater had traveled 12 miles from the breach. The Eder collapse released 202 million tons. The wave moved south through the Eder Valley, then turned west toward Kassel. The torrent carried debris, uprooted trees, demolished buildings, railway cars torn from their tracks. Reconnaissance photographs taken the following morning showed a brown scar 50 miles long cutting through the landscape where the flood had passed. The industrial damage was immediate and measurable. 125 factories in the Ruhr Valley reported flood damage within 48 hours. 11 were destroyed completely, including 2 power stations, 3 coal mines, and a steel rolling mill at Herdecke. Water entered the underground galleries of the Westfalen coal mine near Dortmund, flooding the shafts and drowning the pumping equipment. Production stopped entirely. Steel output collapsed. The Ruhr Valley produced 60% of Germany's steel, and every major plant relied on consistent water supply for cooling the blast furnaces and operating the hydraulic presses. With the reservoirs drained and the supply network wrecked, production dropped 75% in the first week after the raid. Thyssen Steel Works in Hamm reported operations at 20% capacity. Krupp facilities in Essen shut down 3 of their 7 furnaces. The shortage rippled through every sector of German industry. Tank production slowed. Artillery shell manufacturing fell behind quota. Submarine construction at the Baltic yards faced delays due to steel shortages. Hitler responded with characteristic fury. He ordered immediate reconstruction of both dams, pulling 20,000 workers from the Atlantic Wall defenses and reassigning them to the Ruhr Valley. Engineers arrived from across occupied Europe. Concrete, steel reinforcement, heavy machinery, all diverted from military projects to dam repair. The Möhne reconstruction alone required 50,000 cubic meters of concrete and consumed resources equivalent to building 20 concrete bunkers for coastal defense. The Nazi propaganda machine attempted damage control. Newspapers reported minimal casualties, claimed production remained unaffected, published photographs showing repair work already underway. But Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, knew the truth. He inspected the damage personally on May 18th, flying over the breached dams and the flooded valleys. His private assessment, written years later in his memoirs, offered a stark admission of the raid's effectiveness. "A few bombers," Speer wrote, "had delivered a blow which thousands of aircraft could not have achieved." The strategic impact extended beyond industrial disruption. German military planners had assumed deep inland targets like the Ruhr dams were invulnerable to precision attack. The raid shattered that assumption. If Bomber Command could breach reinforced concrete structures at night using experimental weapons, then no fixed installation anywhere in occupied Europe was truly safe. Submarine pens, railway viaducts, ammunition depots, communication centers all became potential targets for specialized raids. The Luftwaffe reacted by reinforcing air defenses across western Germany. Additional anti-aircraft batteries were installed around critical infrastructure. Night fighter squadrons received orders to intercept low-flying bombers more aggressively. Resources that could have been deployed on the Eastern Front or in the Mediterranean stayed in Germany, protecting industrial targets from future attacks that might never come. The simple threat of another precision raid forced a defensive reallocation of men and equipment. Water levels in the Möhne reservoir did not return to operational capacity until September 1943. The Eder took even longer, not reaching full capacity until October. For 5 months, steel production remained suppressed. Coal mining operations struggled with flooding, and German industry operated under constraints that affected everything from tank manufacturing to ammunition supply. The raid achieved exactly what Wallis had calculated in his garden experiments 2 years earlier. One weapon, used correctly, could accomplish what conventional bombing never could. 8 Lancaster bombers did not return to Scampton. 53 men were gone. That represented 40% of the crews who had taken off the previous evening. Flight Lieutenant Hopgood and 5 of his crew perished when their aircraft exploded over the Möhne. Flight Lieutenant Maudsley crashed into high-voltage lines near the Eder, his Lancaster disintegrating on impact. Flight Lieutenant Astel struck a pylon while crossing the Rhine at low altitude. Flight Lieutenant Barlow hit trees during the approach to the Sorpe. Flight Lieutenant Byers was shot down by anti-aircraft fire near Hamm. Flight Lieutenant Otley's aircraft took a direct hit over the Möhne and went down in flames. Flight Lieutenant Young crashed into the North Sea on the return flight, cause unknown. 3 crew members were captured and spent the remainder of the war as prisoners. The rest were buried in German military cemeteries, their graves marked with simple wooden crosses. The average age of those lost was 22 years old. Gibson wrote letters to every family, explaining that their sons, brothers, and husbands had participated in an operation of extraordinary importance, that their sacrifice had contributed to a significant strategic victory. He could not tell them what the operation had been. Security protocols remained in effect. The survivors landed back at Scampton between 03:15 and 0600 hours on May 17th. Ground crews counted the aircraft as they touched down. 13 returned. Damage reports showed flak holes, shattered canopies, hydraulic leaks, engines running rough. Gibson's Lancaster had taken multiple hits, but remained airworthy. He climbed out of the cockpit, walked to the operations room, and filed his mission report. Then he went to the officers' mess and drank until the sun came up. The Air Ministry released news of the raid on May 18th. Newspapers across Britain ran headlines celebrating the destruction of the Ruhr dams. Photographs showed the breached Möhne wall, water still pouring through the gap. The BBC broadcast interviews with returning air crews, carefully edited to avoid revealing operational details. King George VI sent personal congratulations to Gibson and the squadron. Churchill mentioned the raid in Parliament, calling it a triumph of British engineering and courage. Gibson received the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military decoration for valor, presented by the King at Buckingham Palace on June 22nd. 33 other members of 617 Squadron received decorations: Distinguished Service Orders, Distinguished Flying Crosses, Distinguished Flying Medals. The awards ceremony made front-page news. Gibson's photograph appeared in newspapers worldwide, the young wing commander who had led the impossible raid and survived. Barnes Wallis received no public recognition. His name appeared in no newspapers, no official statements, no government announcements. Security protocols prohibited any mention of the bomb's designer. But within military and engineering circles, word spread quickly. The director of scientific research at the Ministry of Aircraft Production wrote to congratulate him. Colleagues at Vickers sent letters of praise. The Royal Commission on Awards to Inventors eventually granted him £10,000 for his contribution to the war effort, a significant sum equivalent to several years' salary. Wallis gave the entire amount away. He divided the money between the Royal Air Force Benevolent Fund and charities supporting injured airmen and their families. When asked why, he provided a written statement that reflected his feelings about the raid's human cost. "For me," Wallis wrote, "the subsequent success was almost completely blotted out by the sense of loss of those wonderful young lives." He refused interviews, declined public appearances, and returned to his work at Vickers. The bouncing bomb had proven the concept. Now he wanted to develop weapons with even greater destructive capability. Within months, he began designing deep penetration bombs capable of destroying targets that conventional explosives could not touch. The result was Tallboy, a 12,000-pound bomb with a streamlined casing designed to break the sound barrier in free fall, penetrating deep into earth or concrete before detonating. Tallboy entered operational service in June 1944. RAF bombers used it to destroy V-2 rocket storage bunkers in northern France, collapsing reinforced concrete structures that had withstood thousands of conventional bombs. The weapon proved so effective that Wallis designed an even larger version. Grand Slam weighed 22,000 pounds. the heaviest conventional bomb used during the war. It required specially modified Lancaster bombers just to carry it. On November 12, 1944, 29 Lancaster bombers, armed with tallboy bombs, attacked the German battleship Tirpitz, anchored in Tromsø Fjord, Norway. The ship had survived multiple aerial attacks, protected by heavy armor and anti-aircraft defenses. 3 tallboy bombs struck directly. One penetrated the forward deck, detonated inside the hull, and triggered a catastrophic magazine explosion. Tirpitz capsized within minutes. Over 1,000 crew members perished. The last major German surface warship was gone. Grand Slam bombs destroyed railway viaducts across Germany, collapsed U-boat pens at Farge, and demolished the Arnsberg railway bridge despite repeated conventional bombing failures. Every weapon traced its lineage directly back to those garden experiments with marbles and a wash tub. Wallis had proven that unconventional thinking, supported by rigorous mathematics and relentless testing, could solve problems that conventional military minds dismissed as impossible. Guy Gibson did not survive the war. On September 19, 1944, he flew a Mosquito bomber on a raid over Germany. His aircraft crashed near Steenbergen in the Netherlands. He was 26 years old. The cause of the crash was never conclusively determined. Some reports suggested mechanical failure. Others claimed he was shot down by German night fighters. His body was recovered and buried in the local cemetery. After the war, his remains were relocated to the Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery at Steenbergen, where his headstone reads simply, Wing Commander Guy Gibson, Victoria Cross, Distinguished Service Order and Bar, Distinguished Flying Cross and Bar, Royal Air Force, 19th September, 1944, age 26. Barnes Wallis continued working until his retirement in 1971. He developed swing-wing aircraft designs, supersonic transport concepts, and advanced structural engineering techniques. He was knighted in 1968 for his contributions to aerospace engineering. He passed away in October 1979 at the age of 92. In his final years, he remained uncomfortable discussing the dam raid, always returning to the thought of those 53 young men who had not come home. The weapon had worked exactly as designed. The mission had succeeded. The cost remained with him for the rest of his life.